like to welcome John Martin to the stage, please. John is our labor economist in the group. So time for us to learn a little bit about facts about how the labor market is evolving. And John's got special knowledge about both France and Ireland and throughout Europe. So I'm, among others, I hope, eager to learn from you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Larry. When the organizers asked me to address the topic of the implications of new working models, I must say I gulped at first. I'm not great at crystal ball gazing in the first place, and if truth be told, I believe it's really too early to prognosticate about this topic. Not that this has prevented many commentators from rushing to judgment on the question based on their opinions on very few facts, on anecdotes, and scattered unrepresentative surveys. In my view, we should be skeptical of such views and realize that it will take quite some time to see what shape the new working models will take eventually. But nevertheless, I have to sing for my supper, so you'll have to put up with me. I want to begin, actually, by illustrating the danger of rushing to quick judgments about labor market trends which are simply not backed by the facts. I will then focus a bit on remote working, which has flourished during the pandemic, and consider some of the implications for public policy. But let me turn to a fact that may not be a fact. Ask yourselves how many times you've read or heard the assertion that lifetime employment is dead or dying, that workers, especially new entrants and middle-aged workers, must prepare themselves for changing jobs and occupations many times in their careers in line with changing product and skill demands. But the truth is much more prosaic, actually, if we look at labor force survey data on job tenure. That is the length of time that an individual has been employed in their current job. Now, data from my old organization show that on average, across 30 countries, workers reported current job tenures, and that's in their current job, of 9.6 years in 2000, which rose slightly to 10.1 years in 2020. Put another way, almost 36% of workers in the OECD area had a job tenure of 10 years or more in 2020, compared with 34% in 2000. And even longer job tenures are quite common. Microdata from the European Union Labour Force Survey shows that around 1 in every 6 workers in the European Union in 2019 had a job tenure of 20 or more years. And that's just in their current job. Now, there are, of course, large cross-country differences in average job tenures. The US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the Nordics, and the Baltics tend to have below-average job tenures, while the southern European countries, France, Germany, and Japan, have above-average job tenures. But what I want you to remember is it still remains true that many workers in OECD countries are currently working in jobs with firms that will last for a long time. So that's to sum up my first key point. Despite the many predictions to the contrary, lifetime employment is actually thriving in many OECD countries. And I would say that the reason for this is obvious. Both firms and workers have a strong mutual interest in maintaining a long-term relationship which safeguards firm-specific knowledge and experience and trust. And I very much doubt, and I'm going to put my head on the block here a little bit, I very much doubt that the pandemic will change this relationship. Now let me turn to the topic of remote working and nomad working, which we've discussed several times already. The first point to make is that these modes of working are not new. They existed prior to the pandemic, but they were more relatively niche in some ways more of a novelty, a bit like gig workers whose significance in the workforce is often exaggerated, at least for the moment. But it has to be admitted that the pandemic has turbocharged these modes of working, especially remote working. And there can be little doubt that some workers and employers will wish to stick with remote working once the pandemic is past. There's a recent National Bureau of Economic Research paper entitled "Why Working from Home Will Stick," which surveyed about 30,000 Americans and concluded that 20% of full-time hours could be worked from home after the pandemic, compared with only 5% before the pandemic. And if this prediction comes to pass, it will certainly represent a major shift in working patterns, which will have huge implications for commuting patterns, public transport, urban, suburban, rural divides, etc. I would also add that it will necessitate a major rethinking of employment regulations and collective bargaining practices governing such issues as occupational health and safety, working time, equality, cybersecurity, and monitoring of employees to control shirking. But remote working and nomad working have once again brought into highlight a long-standing inequality in the labor market. Not everyone has been able to avail of these work modes. Once again, low-educated, low-skilled workers have tended to be left behind. Either they have had to continue to work in service jobs which require a physical presence in the workplace, or they are facing a higher risk of becoming unemployed or dropping out of the labor force, or they live in an area without adequate broadband access. Now, this is nothing new. The combined workings of globalization, technological change, and the deregulation of labor and product markets over the past 3 or more decades have led to reduced demands for low-skilled and middle-skilled workers while expanding the demand for high-skilled workers, which in turn, as we know, has contributed to growing wage and income inequality in many OECD countries. And this is sometimes called the Matthew effect, after the well-known line from the Saints' Gospel. And I'm going to give you the James version. It reads as follows: "For whoever soever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even what he has." So my second key point, ladies and gentlemen, is that the new modes of working will exacerbate this Matthew effect, working to favor high-skilled, high-educated workers, and this will pose major challenges for policymakers, to which I'll return in a few moments. So now that our economies are emerging from the lockdown, there's much speculation about what the future work model will look like. Will there be a return to the pre-pandemic norm of mainly full-time office working, or will the NBER prediction of a hybrid model combining remote working with part-week work in the office prevail? It's difficult to be definitive at this stage since it's early days. We need to take account of so many different factors: personal, environmental, social, and economic. And we also need to bear in mind that the interests of many employers and workers may well be divergent on this particular dossier. Let's consider the viewpoint of employers for a moment. They may want to get as many of their staff back on site as soon as public health restrictions permit. After all, having unused office space is costly for them. They also want, as we know and we've heard, they want to create a productive working environment which fosters good working relationships between their staff and helps initiate new recruits into the corporate culture. Video conferencing, as we all know, is all very well, and it's certainly demonstrated its worth during the lockdown, but it's also, I would take the view, revealed its limits as an effective tool of business life. There's also, to my mind, the unanswered $64,000 question about these new modes of working. Will they actually prove to boost creativity and productivity or not? The evidence at the moment is rather ambiguous on this point. Some studies say yes, and other studies say definitely no. So, at the same time, however, employers want to pay attention to the attractiveness of their offers of working arrangements, so if they want to hire new workers or retain existing staff. So now let's turn to the workers' viewpoint for a moment. There's no doubt that some of them have enjoyed remote working and will want to persist with it if their employer is agreeable or if they're self-employed. But will they want to continue working remotely almost full-time, or will they prefer to opt for a hybrid model? Bearing in mind that many employers who want to offer a hybrid model do not want to offer great flexibility within it. They insist that, if it's 3 and 2, you do 3 and 2 the same days every week and so forth. We don't want you to be able to opt for complete flexibility. Other workers will have missed the social and creative side of working side by side with colleagues and will be keen to get back to the office in a more normal routine. Not for nothing, ladies and gentlemen, did the Nobel Prize winner in economics, Bob Solow, publish a book in 1990 entitled The Labor Market as a Social Institution. Our work and interactions with our colleagues help meet important social and psychological needs for individuals, as well as providing financial security. It's not easy to see how these particular needs can be met by remote working, and certainly not if it's almost full-time. And now, how the interests of employers and workers will play out on this dossier will depend, among other factors, on the relative bargaining strengths of employers, workers, and unions. Prior to the pandemic, employers tended to hold more of the cards, reflected in growing wage inequality and declining labor shares in national income in many countries. Now, I don't know if you've seen a recent supplement in The Economist on the future of work puts a more optimistic slant on the story from the perspective of workers, arguing that the balance of power in the labor market is likely to shift more in favor of workers. Other commentators have highlighted reports of labor shortages in recent months as a sign that the tide is with workers. However, there's nothing new about reports of labor shortages in a recovery, I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, having followed this for many years. And another influential commentator, the Financial Times business columnist Pelita Clark, takes a more skeptical view about bargaining power shifting towards workers in the post-pandemic world. My third point is that only time will tell who's right on this key issue. I'm sorry. And it's interesting to note, the final issue is, The Economist supplement balances its view that labor will gain by acknowledging that the low-skilled, low-educated workers are likely to lose out yet again unless they get effective assistance from governments and employers to upgrade and reskill. Now, this is not a new trend at all, but it does muddy the picture looking forward. Now, the track record of OECD governments in assisting the losers in the labor market to upgrade their skills and make them more competitive for new jobs is not very encouraging. For example, with regard to access to training, the evidence in all OECD countries is that the Matthew effect dominates. For example, that the more educated, more skilled workers get more access and more investment in training. Though some countries, notably the Nordics, the Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand, do a bit better in encouraging participation in upskilling by the low-skilled than most EU countries or the United States. As I mentioned this morning, one long-standing issue we know is that investment in lifelong learning continues to be front-loaded in all countries. It's proved extremely hard to tackle the obstacles to investment in further education and training on the part of prime age and older workers. These obstacles typically take three forms. One is financial, it's costly. A second is time, and this is particularly a constraint for people in their middle ages with families and children, working partners and the like. And lastly, there's a motivational constraint. It's very interesting that in surveys of older workers who are asked about their attitudes to lifelong learning and upgrading, they often say they do not see the interest or the wish to engage in it. Now, many innovations have been tried in OECD countries to overcome these constraints. Subsidies to training to both workers and employers, individual learning training accounts, creating competition between public and private training providers, etc. But the evidence base, the rigorous evidence base on what works in this area is limited, and what there is not always very encouraging. My final point is that doing better on this front, on moving away from a front-loaded lifelong learning model to a model that encourages both employers and workers throughout their careers to invest in upgrading it, will be crucial for the success of the new working modes in whatever form they finally emerge. But all interested parties, workers, unions, employers and governments will have to up their game significantly to make this happen. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.